All right, welcome back, everybody. We are here for our next installment of the TOK interview with a subject expert. We have moved on now to the human sciences, and we are here with the venerable Miss Isley. She has been working at WPS for over 10 years. She has taught psychology here not only at WPS, but also at the college level. If she doesn't know the answer, then nobody does if it comes to psychology. So she is our best human scientist that we have here, and she's going to talk to us about how psychology rears its head in TOK. So thank you for joining us, Ms. Isley.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
This is an age-old debate in psychology, so to some extent it's a nice softball down the middle, but it's a hard question to ask too. So I've heard it said that psychology kind of has one foot in the natural sciences and one foot in the human sciences. Psychology often gets referred to as the most scientific and sometimes even the first of the human sciences, kind of like the real OG of the human science, right?
Yes.
So do you think that psychology best fits in the human sciences or the natural sciences?
That is a very complicated question because really, as you said, it has one foot on both sides of the aisle. Kind of dabbles in both, so to speak. You look at the human sciences, looking at human behavior, whether it's individual or group behavior. You look at the natural sciences and the use of the scientific method. Psychology does both. It looks at individual and group behavior, but it can use the scientific method or quantitative research methods to gather information about behavior. Psychologists come up with hypotheses, and you are going through the scientific method, you are gathering data, analyzing it, comparing it back to your original hypothesis using statistics, just like they do in the natural sciences. So it gets complicated.
So could we maybe split up that question of where it best fits as that psychology, its methodology in terms of how we produce the knowledge is more in the natural sciences, whereas the application of it is where the human science part comes in.
That was perfect, actually. I liked that a lot because I do feel like that psychology uses methodology that is similar to the natural sciences. I myself was trained as an experimental and biological scientist. So I approach psychology as a scientist myself. But when you look at the results from that research, you're hoping to apply it in real life, which does fit in with the human sciences.
So that what you just mentioned there about the training that you went through as a psychologist in TOK, that's called a positivist approach. And in the human sciences, people with a positivist approach, try to make the human sciences as scientific as they can.
Oh, that's me.
That's good. Good. You are a positivist, Ms. Isley.
Okay, I did not know that. I learned something new.
So the next question, further to the idea of trying to produce knowledge in the human sciences, as a psychologist, what are the main difficulties that psychologists encounter when they are trying to provide explanations of human behavior?
Well, first off, we have biases that can be a problem, whether it be on the researcher side or even on the participant side, because when you're working with people as opposed to atoms or plants or something that's more in the natural environment, you don't have to worry about those kinds of things. But the researcher can go into it with certain expectations and unconsciously influence data collection or the participants themselves. Participants can also, kind of figure out, oh, maybe this is what the researcher's looking for. There's something, called the screw you effect too, where they actually deliberately try to mess with you and give you inaccurate results, but other times they try to give you what you would like. So
Like a real problem.
yes, so that could be a problem. Also, ethics could be an issue because we have to have ethical guidelines. Back in the 1960s, there were quite a few different experiments that were done where the guidelines were a little tweaked, shall we say, or early 70s. You think of the Milgram obedience experiments or the Stanford prison experiment. And did we learn some very useful information? Yes, but again, was it worth it causing the mental harm to the participants?
So we can do an experiment with like a viral cell of the coronavirus.
Yes.
The coronavirus is not shy. It's going to behave, right? But a
Yes.
human being will change their behavior depending on how they're observed.
Yes, they will. We also have something called social desirability, where the participants will try to make themselves appear better than they are. Like if you're talking about interviews or surveys where you're asking people to answer questions, they're not always honest.
Okay. So in psychology, it seems like there are often explanations for things that are at least at a little bit in competition with one another.
Yes.
And then, like, what is the best explanation for why someone is behaving a certain way, or why a group of people are behaving a certain way? So in psychology, when we are presented with two competing paradigms, which give different explanations of human behavior, how can we decide which is the best explanation to accept?
Well, one way is to think about how the data was collected. Was it more of a scientific approach? Was it a more qualitative or descriptive approach? Generally speaking, the more quantitative data we call generalization, where we relate the information to other people or other similar situations. That works better for quantitative theory, works better for qualitative data. So you could look at it from that perspective. There's also a technique called a meta-analysis, where you can gather large pieces of research and put them through a statistical calculator and see what comes out, and whether or not in general, even though you've got competing theories about something, which does it lean closer towards.
So are there sort of competing schools of thought in psychology? Are there like groups of psychologists that think differently within psychology?
Oh, yes.
What do they argue about?
Nature versus nurture is one. Is behavior a product of your genetics or your environment? Most agree that it's both, but in the past, there were psychologists who focused only on genetics or only focused on the environment and didn't think about the two overlapping. Is behavior the product of your thinking and your mental processes? Is it the product of the social environment that you're in? Is it your brain and the chemicals in your brain?
So it seems like in the human sciences, we should be very wary of explanations that are very simple, as in like, this factor definitely explains this outcome.
Right. I would say so. I agree with that. Yeah.
Because what's likely to be true is there's a range of factors that are leading to that outcome that we need to think about.
Right. Because, you have to remember, behavior is complex. It's hard to, just focus on this absolutely causes this.
Right.
Kind of thing.
Which I would say, based on some of the TOK essays that I've read before, it is true to say that human behavior is complex, but that doesn't mean we should stop there, right?
Right.
We should try to think about, well, what's the best way we should try to measure that?
Yes, of course. And you can do it in pieces, to try to get the big picture. In IB psychology, we talk about something called the biopsychosocial model, where we try to look at behavior through a biological lens, looking at the brain, neurotransmitters, genetics, the cognitive approach, which looks at your thinking and your mental processes, and then your social or sociocultural factors like your peer groups and what's happening in your environment. And to truly understand behavior, you have to have all three pieces.
Okay, so my next question is circling back to kind of what we started talking about to begin with.
Okay.
And that is, to what extent are the methods used to gain or produce knowledge
Mhm.
in psychology, to what extent are they scientific?
I believe they are. A natural scientist might disagree with me. They tend to call psychology a soft science. I know.
How dare they?
I know. They do not view us the same way, the biologists, the physicists, and the chemists. But we're using the scientific method. We are testing valid hypotheses. We are using statistical measures to analyze the data. We use the same probability value, p-value, right, 0.05. So as the natural sciences, so suggesting that, if we have a result that indicates that our probability value is less than or equal to 0.05, then we can reject our null hypothesis and accept our experimental. And that means that only 5% of the time are the results due to chance. 95% of the time it's due to the effect of the independent variable on the dependent variable.
So I've heard it said that in the human sciences, it is more difficult to use experimental methods to try to isolate one variable at a time than it is in the natural sciences, that there's more variables to control for and they're harder to pin down. Would you say that's true?
That is correct. Yes, we call them confounding variables. And as a scientist, you're trying to control for those as much as you possibly can. But, as I said, humans are a little more complicated than plants or cells or atoms. And so it is more complicated. They do also use animal models sometimes, and those are easier to control than humans. But again, we have a generalizability issue, right? Taking what happens in the animal to the human, it's a starting place to understand it, but it doesn't, mean that, oh, well, just because this happened in this mouse does not mean that it's, 100% transferable to humans.
Right, right. I think you often see a lot of studies like that with pigs as well.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, the last one you've touched on a little bit so far, but I'm hoping you can go in a little bit further detail. Just
Okay.
to the idea of methodology and controlling for things. Ultimately, if we're going to have good experimental methods in the human sciences, we kind of need to control people.
I know.
A bit tricky to think about, right? So the last question I have for you is, to what extent are the methods used in the human sciences limited by ethical considerations involved in studying human beings?
They are limited. It's again, a complicated issue, because when you look at some of those experiments that were done in the 60s and early 70s, where we did gather some interesting information, but at what cost? Right. The Stanford prison experiment, if you're familiar with it, they did, it was very eye-opening. But on the other hand, for 5 or 6 days, those individuals who were prisoners really suffered mentally and physically. And so was that worth the knowledge gained?
Yeah, so we have talked about the Stanford prison experiment in our class, and we sort of covered it from the standpoint that, yeah, it's an obvious deviation from any kind of ethical consideration, but also in that it's a really just not a valid study because a lot of the participants were kind of coached up.
Yes, that has come out after the fact that Zimbardo may have coached them a little bit during the course of the study. After that particular experiment was conducted, the APA did become a little stricter, American Psychological Association, about their guidelines. And today they are very strict about the whole mental physical harm, which does limit, right, what you can do. So the ethical concerns do interfere with the methodology, yes.
So we are in the human sciences, we are limited on the kinds of experiments that we can do, and
Yes.
we should be, right?
Yes,
That
right.
doesn't mean that we should not do any experimentation involving people. So if we're going to do a good study in psychology,
Hmm.
what are some ethical hurdles that we need to get over?
Okay, so in IB psychology, they recommend 6 ethical guidelines. One is to make sure that you have informed consent from the participant, although there are some past studies that were done that were covert observations where people, okay, in one case, they went into a cult and yes, took down data. That was back in the 50s. And then in the 70s, there was a covert observation where the researchers went into psychiatric hospitals and pretended to be psychiatric patients undercover. So in that case, we don't have informed consent. But generally, the participant should be giving their consent to be part of it. Most psychological research does use deception because you don't want the participants to know exactly what your aim is, because then they may try to act in a way to either help you or hurt you.
Seems like in that instance, a double-blind study might.
Yes, well, that's the best you can do, is if you can do a double blind, that is the best to do. Often we do single blind though, where the participant doesn't know and the psychologist does.
Okay.
But if you use deception and you debrief them, you tell them at the end what everything was about and why you were doing this, and there isn't any lasting mental or physical harm, you can use the deception. Okay. Confidentiality is another one, and right to withdraw. The participants can leave at any time. They can walk out of your experiment in the middle of it.
So you need consent to start, but then you also need sort of like the idea of continuous consent.
Yes.
They say abort.
Yes, and they can even change their mind at the end. Like if they get to the end of it, you debrief, they're mad that you deceived them, or they don't like
right.
what data you gathered about them, they can change their minds then too.
So at the end of an experiment, you need to say, we deceived you, but we deceived you ethically.
Yes, yes. And when my IB juniors are coming around collecting data for their IA, they have to run a replication of an experiment. So they have to do all that.
So this is always the interesting part of applying TOK to individual subjects, is it always comes down to the internal assessment.
Mm-hmm.
As far as I understand it, the IA in psychology, they basically need to design their own study.
It has to be, they do. It's a replication of something that's already been done. They don't come up with an original experiment, but they're taking parts of experiments that have been done previously and put their own twist on it. Yes. So RIA is more like the natural sciences,
right,
than the human sciences or the other group 3.
As in, like, you would start, the students would start their process with the idea of observation first. They would observe something happen, but that doesn't really so much happen in business management or even economics.
Right, right. Nope, they have to write up an introduction, like do background research, come up with a procedure, follow the ethical guidelines, put the results through statistics. They have to do a statistics calculator and then do an evaluation of the strengths and limitations of their methodology.
Okay, so that sounds like a really good overlap between an individual subject and TOK. Is how did they design their study to measure what they wanted it to measure?
Right.
Yeah, cool. Well, thank you, Ms. Isley. I said at the beginning that if you didn't know it, then no one here was going to know it. You answered all the questions with seemingly no trouble at all. So,
well, thank you. I appreciate that. I will admit I was a little nervous.
you nailed it. You nailed it.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And hopefully I was helpful to the students out there on your YouTube channel.
Well, you were high on the list of requested teachers. We have a lot of psychologists in TOK, so I'm sure that's
Okay. Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
all right. Thanks again.
Thank you. Bye.